So thanks everybody for coming. This is the ninth annual Codman Shoulder Society meeting, and the first time we've really done a partnership with two others. Now we've partnered with Avant-Garde in the past, but never with the Journal of Orthopedic Experience and Innovation. So this will be flavorful for sure. I'd like to thank Ira and Derek for partnering in this presentation. And just by way of introduction, the Codman Shoulder Society was founded in 2014 because I work in the home of Codman, which is a Mass General hospital. Codman was actually the first person to introduce the concept of the end result about 100 years ago. And that concept was to determine best practices to optimize outcomes by measuring, something which has since been scaled significantly. But more importantly, he was also an entrepreneur. And the question of innovation is something he addressed early on, and he suffered for it, frankly. He said, give me something different for there's a chance of it being better. Folks in those days didn't really like different things. Among the things that he accomplished during his lifetime included the end result concept, and you can see these boxes in which he had end result cards measuring the outcomes of all his patients. He believed that outcomes should be measured, and if patients didn't have satisfactory outcomes, they should be refunded. In those days, we didn't have the same insurance situation, so patients often paid. He created the first anesthesia record with his colleague at the Brigham. He created the sarcoma registry. He was the first to use x-rays for fracture treatment. He was the first to publish a book on the shoulder in English, and the first to write a book on hospital efficiency. Now, many of you know Michael Porter, and while Michael Porter's been incredibly influential, and Susanna Gallani, who's our keynote speaker, had worked with him and been part of his value-based healthcare initiative, it was really Codman who started the ball rolling. He just called it the end result concept, and Porter popularized this in this book, calling it value-based healthcare, which basically has been a movement for some time now. The Codman Shoulder Society has had a number of meetings, most of them on site. This was our 2016 meeting. Our visiting professor at that time was the world's expert on evidence-based medicine, Mohit Bhandari, who talked about evidence and value and how we can align these. Then in 2019, Bob Kaplan was our visiting speaker, and he talked about how to measure outcomes and quality in healthcare. And then in 2022, we specifically looked at digital technology, and we're going to have a presentation on that today as well. And then in 2023, we had a program on innovation, entrepreneurism, culture, value-based healthcare, and leadership and career development. Our keynote speaker at this meeting is Susanna Gallani, who's been kind enough to come and give her time. She's the Thai Family Associate Professor of Business Administration, and she works in the accounting and management unit and has contributed quite significantly an executive program at Harvard Business School, including the program for leadership development, managing healthcare delivery, driving corporate performance, and working in the healthcare delivery and leadership program at Harvard Medical School. And her talk's going to be on physician-hospital alignment, and that'll be beginning of part of the first part of our presentation. So with that, I'm going to just sum it up by thanking Ira and Derek, and I'm going to yield and let each of them come on and say a little bit about their companies.
Derek, why don't you go first?
Great. Thanks, Ira. Thanks, JP. Very excited to be connecting with everybody today. So I know many of the folks on the conversation this evening are physicians. Just wanted to start off with a little bit of background on my own family. So I grew up in central Massachusetts in a town called Shrewsbury. And this picture is very meaningful to me from 30 years ago, now the same age as my parents were and have my own kids. And at that point in time, we had an exchange student from Japan that lived with us. And then there's my mom, my dad, my brother, my sister, and then myself. So only non-physician in my family. I grew up hearing about ultimate challenge and frustrations they've been experiencing trying to live a high-quality care and increasing resource-constrained environment. And so this was a big influence with me on starting Avant-Garde Health back in 2014. And Avant-Garde Health grew out of work I was doing with Mike Porter and Bob Kaplan. It's co-leading their value-based healthcare research. I actually met JP back in January of 2013. We were both taking the intensive seminar together at the school. And through Avant-Garde Health, we work with health systems, surgery centers, and physicians to help them get as robust a set of insights as possible into all the different facets of their surgical care and help them understand where the opportunities to improve how they deliver their care to do it in the same or higher quality, but a more financially optimal way. And recognizing many institutions are under a great deal of financial pressure, we're able to help through our analytics, help people understand where the opportunities to improve the care processes, the flows, types of staff who are involved delivering the care, how much time people are spending, be able to help optimize and improve the surgical throughput. And weave in all the great information around enhanced recovery after surgery, patient-reported outcomes, and also ensure cases are accurately being coded to provide holistic insight into opportunities to improve the care flow. And so with that, I'll pass the baton to Ira.
All right. Thank you. I am going to just briefly introduce the Journal of Orthopedic Experience and Innovation. This was my second publishing effort. My first was in the 1990s when I was one of the 12 founders of Medscape, and we took it public in 1999. And I don't know why I waited 25 years to do this one, but about 4 years ago, I felt that there was a problem in publishing for a variety of reasons. Surgeon experience wasn't being valued. There wasn't a voice for innovation. Innovation did not come out and publish early. And so we came up with the Journal of Orthopedic Experience and Innovation. It's been nicknamed Joey, Joei. Our mascot is a kangaroo. We pride ourselves on our editorial board, which is quite a lot of people. Some are here tonight. We run many articles on innovation and experience. We even have a series called In My Experience, where surgeons really focus on a very specific aspect of their experience. And just to kind of finally just show you the real data, we started 4 years ago on March 14th, 2020, the first day of COVID lockdown. We like to feel we're more viral than COVID right now. We have 15,000 page views, 12,000 article page views, and almost 10,000 unique visitors a month. So we're pleased and want to thank a lot of people who are on this call right now who have been authors. And some of our articles get as many as 20,000 views. We want to thank our authors for that. So I'm going to stop my share right now. Okay. Okay.
So for the evening, we're having this broken into two different sections. The first section, something near and dear to our heart around physician and hospital collaboration, financial alignment for cost management. And as JP mentioned, we're grateful for Dr. Susanna Gallani to do the keynote to lead up around how to think about physician and hospital alignment, alternate compensation strategies. Then we're going to pass the baton to Van Lancker, who's Cambridge Health Alliance and recently implemented a really novel gain sharing program with orthopedics department. Then my colleague Porter Jones will talk a little bit more about co-management alternate compensation strategies. And JP will back clean up here for this first section and talk about co-management gain sharing barriers in AMC. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Gallani.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here with you. Let me just start sharing my screen. I assume you can all see it. So I'm super excited to have the opportunity to engage with you. You should know that I am, as always in this kind of events, the oddball here, because very much like Derek, I am not a physician, but I also don't have any physician in my family. So I really learned about healthcare as an outsider. And I had questions. About what I was observing. So today I'm going to share some of my thoughts. Of course, I only have a short period of time to do it, and we're going to scratch the surface. So what I want to share with you is some high-level thoughts. Of course, if you want to engage with me and have additional conversations about this, you can find me, and I will talk about this as long as you will. And those of you that know me have experienced that. So let's get right into that. So there we go. So when we think about alignment, we have to think about what are we aligning with, right? Whose goals are we aligning our behaviors to? Alignment means, working in a way that we can all drive in the same direction. And we have to have a direction. So what I have observed, again, as an outsider, is that there are certain problems, I would say, certain suboptimal type of dynamics in the healthcare industry, at least for my observations in the United States, but not only in the United States. I've seen similar things in other markets as well. And if we think about the relationships between these four key players in the healthcare, let's call it ecosystem, we have contractual relationships among these players. So what I will not talk about tonight, just because we don't have a lot of time, is the direct contractual relationship between the physician and the payer. So if you are a standalone practice, if you build directly for your own, what I'm about to share may not apply directly to you, but there might be other versions of that. But when we think about the contractual relationships in the market, in the healthcare industry, we have separate contracts between separate entities. And these are the entities that we, we have the very basic set of these entities. And so there's a whole lot of contracts between these entities. Payers pay hospitals for, the technical fees. Payers pay physician organizations or other entities that hire you, the physician. So the physician organization pays you, the physician's organization might pay the hospital. So there's a whole lot of contractual relationships between these entities. And due to the current situation with respect to payment models and practices that I have observed in healthcare, what we see is the result of the current situation is that the individual physician decisions, behaviors, and activities tend to be aligned to the goals of the payer. Because if we think about very simply, fee for service, pays for volumes, pay for a specific type of procedures, it trickles down to an RVU-based or a volume-based compensation for you guys, which means that you are working in the interest of the goals of the payer. And that is one of the biggest questions I had, like, how is that right? And so what I want to propose to you is that instead, every one of these entities have their own strategic goals and can therefore drive alignment within their organizations in order to align the behaviors, the decisions, the effort, the skills, and the activities of the people that work for them toward the goal that they set for themselves. So there is no need to align across contracts. Every entity is the owner or should be the owner of their own strategic goals. And yes, there are regulatory barriers, for sure. There are restrictions, but they're not so stringent as many people think. Actually, recently, with the 2021 revision of the anti-kickback provisions, there have been several relaxations of the constraints that were once there. So I would encourage people to explore this space and see what can be done to align the behaviors of the people that work in the organization to the goals of the organization. Now, what does that mean? It means that we need to start, this slide should be read from the right back to the left. So following the red arrow that says reverse engineering. My opinion, my stance is that healthcare institutions need to regain ownership of their own strategic goals. I feel that there's an opportunity to do that much more and much more intentionally. And many of you probably don't need to do better than they already are. But generally, based on my conversations, I believe there's room for improvement there. So if we think about, the concept of value that Dr. Warner mentioned in terms of value-based healthcare, it needs to be defined at the individual institution level. What does it mean to deliver value in your institution? And delivering value means to consider who your patients are, what is your patient population looking like, what services do you provide, what are the things that you can do for them, but also what do you do best? And then once you have defined what the value is and the strategic goal to deliver the best value, the maximum value that you can deliver, then you have to understand what drives that value and reverse engineer those activities and behaviors that drive value. Otherwise, the rest is not important. And those are the activities that need to be measured and rewarded. This is what we call alignment, because now everybody is pulling in the right direction, everybody's pulling in the same direction, and everybody understands how their activities and behaviors and decisions and contributions contribute to deliver that organizational value. A lot of times I see organizations building from the left to the right. They acquire a bunch of talent, they acquire a bunch of assets, they acquire a bunch of skills, and then they try to find ways on how they can use it in the best way possible. I really encourage you to do the opposite. Think about, where do you want to be? What is the definition of value for your organization? And what do you need to do to deliver on that? So when we think about compensation, compensation is a very, very powerful mechanism, much more powerful than we give it credit for. There is a long history of research. This is not me. People that are much smarter and much more accomplished than I ever will have written for decades about the multitasking environment. This is an economic definition for the situation that we all find ourselves in. We have a lot of responsibilities, a lot of activities, a lot of targets, a lot of deliverables, and we only have a finite amount of time, effort, skills, ability to the capacity, if you will. So when we construct a compensation model, we have to be very careful about what is it that we're communicating. In a multitasking environment, research shows that there are 3 tiebreakers. 1, what is explicitly paid for? So if you paid for something, if you attach a compensation amount to a specific metric, that becomes instantly more important than others that you're not paying explicitly for. The second tiebreaker is what is easier to measure. Because of course, if something is easier to measure, I can map my decisions, activities, and behaviors to that metric. I know how to move that metric. And so I can focus on things that I know how to make them better. The third is what I'm good at. So if I have all else equal, things that are paid for, that are easy to measure, then I'm going to default in what I'm actually good at. So when we think about compensation contracts, we have to think about what is it that we're sending. Are we sending mixed signals? Let's think about the canonical RVU-based compensation. That, in and of itself, says volumes are king. That's all we care about. If I pay you for RVUs, I care about volume. Now, we can tell people all day long that we care about more than volume, but we're only paying for volume. And so this is what happens. The tiebreakers kick in. Volumes will be more important than all the other things that we say they are important. I want to point to this book, which I have no credit for, absolutely. This is a behavioral economist, one of my favorite authors. His name is Uri Nisi. And this book is very, very simple, and it really brings the point across. So if you have time, over the summer, I recommend the read. So when we think about compensation, we need to think about messaging. The construction of your compensation plan, it is indeed the strongest signal that you can provide about what priorities your entities is pursuing. Now, what does it mean to compensate? So how should we compensate people in order to align these priorities? So there's a continuum, and probably all of you that are in practice are paid with a construction that is somewhere on this continuum, probably not at the extremes, but some of you might. Let's start from the volume-based compensation, which is what we were just talking about. There are good things about volume-based compensation. I am not at all in favor of removing a volume component from compensation, because we need to see a lot of patients, we need to generate revenue. So the good things about the volume-based compensation style is that it gives the physician, the individual provider, control over their earnings. If I work more, I earn more. So I have a lever that I can use to control the amount that I bring home. It's generally aligned with revenue, at least in the current system in the United States, because again, there's that connection between fee-for-service and RVUs, and it is generally financially viable because what you get paid for an RVU is generally less than what the revenue generated is. So generally, it works. It doesn't lose money. Now, the downside of a volume-based paid is that, again, as we were just saying, it prioritizes volume. It becomes transactional. This is another aspect that's important. It becomes a very, very stark exchange of things that you do for money that you get. And all those additional behaviors that you do, all the little things that you do for your patients, for your hospital, for your colleagues, just fall in the background because of that tiebreaker structure that I just explained. And we know that because of the pressure on volumes, it is a strong driver of burnout and job dissatisfaction. And we know that that's a problem that's very pervasive in this industry. Okay, so one could say, let's go all the way to the other end and let's pay everybody a fixed salary so we don't have any of these problems. Okay, there are good things about fixed salaries. Earnings are very predictable. You know the number is going to be the same no matter what you do. There's less stress on volume, so probably less burnout, less overwork. There's lower mischievous incentives. There's not the moral injury of feeling like I have to produce more, but maybe this is not the right thing for the patient. There's none of that because it's a fixed salary, so there is no pressure to over-indicate or overutilize. However, the fixed salary doesn't give you any clear priority because there is no metric that drives your compensation. And so it's really difficult then to align the behaviors using a fixed salary. The other thing that it could create is perceptions of unfairness. You might think that paying everybody the same amount could be fair, but it is not to the extent that somebody works harder than somebody else, or somebody is better at their job than somebody else. So the meritocracy is not there. And a lot of times this type of structure is considered to be unfair. And the other thing is that it might drive things that are of very little value, things that you like to do or somebody is good at, and they're not really aligned with the goals of the organization. Additionally, it's not just about the money. And I have striked out here the money and just put your money. And there's a reason for that, which I will explain in a second. In one of the cases that we teach at Harvard Business School, there's a very famous case that was written by Professor Robert Simons, and it's the Mary Kay case. Mary Kay is not a healthcare company. That is actually a cosmetic company that used to sell cosmetics over the mail. And what that company came up with was a very interesting combination of ways to motivate and attract and retain the people that wanted to work in that organization. And so they came up with this acronym, STORM, which is very easy to remember. And by no means this is an exhaustive list. But it brings the point across that there's more than money that motivates people, that makes people feel good about themselves and their work. For example, satisfaction, knowing that you're doing a good job, self-esteem, being recognized as an expert, as a good physician, teamwork, being part of a good team, of a winning team, a team that works well together, that delivers good outcomes, opportunities for development, for further education, for personal growth, for professional growth, being said thank you every once in a while, recognition or gratitude. Of course, money, because of course we have to pay the bills. And that always is a question. It is a motivator, at least to some extent. I want to also mention that money, this is the reason why I struck out that and used your money. Money specifically in healthcare, I've seen tangible rewards being given also not to you as part of your paycheck, but in other forms. For example, making buying your time so that you can do other things like research or other things that might interest you, or assigning an extra budget amount to your department for some initiative that you would like to pursue. So there are many ways to use money, not just in your paycheck. Now, here's the thing. If I were to ask all of you to just tell me what you are motivated by, I think that we could guess the list pretty well, right? We could come up with the list if we had to just say, these are things that generally motivate people. And this list that is on this slide is a good starting point. Again, not exhaustive, but a good starting point. Now, here's the work that I'm developing now, and I'm really excited about this. So I want to put a little plug on that as well. These things are differently important for each of you. If you had to rank them, or if you had to decide what's more important than another among this list, you would probably have very different answers. So when we think about ways to motivate people to do their best work, we need to consider that individuals differ among themselves, now across people, to what is important to them and how important that is compared to other things. And also their preferences will evolve over time. Maybe, right out of medical school, you have huge student debt, you're starting a family. Of course, money is going to be super important. But maybe later in your career, you will find that something else is more motivating to you. So I think this is an exciting time to explore these opportunities that we have to motivate people in many ways. constructing better compensation plans, but also using other levers that are at your disposal. And if you want to know more about what I'm doing in this space, please feel free to reach out to me. I would always love to talk about this. So I'm going to stop here. And I'm going to just thank everybody for your attention and your time, and thank the organizers for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you.
Great. Thanks so much, Susanna. Appreciate it. And we'll turn it over to Hans now. Just unmute yourself, Hans.
Yep. Sorry, just looking for the button. Thanks, Derek. Thanks, John. Thanks, Ira. Appreciate you having me. And thanks, Susanna. That was an incredibly insightful talk and really exciting stuff that, makes me feel like maybe we're thinking the right way here. So this is our humble attempt at trying to find a way to make physician compensation make a little bit more sense and try to find some of that physician hospital alignment. So and it's been really largely in part to the relationship that we've developed with Avant-Garde and being able to have that data that's been so helpful to really dig in. So 18 months ago, maybe a little bit more than that at this point, I started at Cambridge Health Alliance and realized there was some work to be done, which is part of the fun of starting a new opportunity and job and part of what I was looking for. But I realized we were in the highest 10% for OR supply costs with a median length of stay that was twice, or a length of stay that was twice the median. And we had a 3-month backlog of orthopedic visits and no existing solution to benchmark data and limited tech and assistance. Tech assistance and communication, and really a group of generalists, but everybody had an interest and a passion for a certain thing, but nobody had cultivated that. So it was really kind of a neat thing to walk into, and I saw a lot of opportunity. So we initiated this partnership with Avant-Garde, and we thought about a bunch of different ways to improve, both using the data and using just a different approach to things. A lot of what you highlighted, Susanna, in the STORM word there, I think there's so much that tracks with that. For me, I've always seen technology as a growing potential solution and something that excites me. And the technology with Avant-Garde really enhanced our ability to understand data in a very useful way. I could see a lot of opportunity with it. We recognized quickly that there was a huge opportunity in OR supply costs, over $5 million over the course of 4 years, and the same thing, very good opportunity with length of stay. So thinking about how am I going to get my team of surgeons that I barely know to buy in, to use this data in a way that's meaningful and actually change what they do. They've been doing the same thing for years, and it's not an easy lift when people are kind of set in their ways, as we all know. I questioned the group sort of as to what their frustrations were, what was most satisfying about their work, what motivates them to change. And one of the things, like in STORM, that comes up is money and reimbursement as a motivating factor. And I thought, well, maybe we could do something with this data that aligns with the institution and aligns with the group that would affect how they're compensated. So maybe that's one way to change a little bit of what we do. And I've implemented some other ways too that I'll touch on, but this is focusing on that bit about how do I use what we learned to improve the compensation. So we created a gain share, and I really had an incredible amount of support and thought put into this from Derek and his great group at Avant-Garde. Thought a bit about how can we change the relationship these our physician employees have, where they really kind of have been and are just cogs in a wheel that contribute to the system, to where they're central figures again. And even as an employee, they have agency and the ability to gain from thoughtful decisions, because that's always what drives me to feel committed and really part of the place that I work. So thought a lot about how to do it right. Created this expectation waterfall. Right now we're at the 90th percentile for cost. We're way up there, in the bad way. So we're at some of the highest costs with regard to our supply costs. how am I going to get us down to the median? Because I think that's a safe place to sort of be your benchmark, and creating an annual stepwise progression there. And then proposing and having it accepted that we can do a 50-50 split between the department and the institution. So, the institution gains and the department gains. And then, creating an equal benefit to everyone in the group. And then, so everyone's working together. So even if someone's sort of the big fish with cost, we can collectively motivate that person to make some changes, because we're all going to benefit from those changes that they make. And then create this median that becomes the floor. So if we can continue to improve past the median, we'll continue to see a benefit. So it's ongoing. It's not a race to the bottom like some of the BPCI work that I've been involved with before. And then, have the system absorb the cost of avant-garde, because they're continuing to benefit considerably from where things started. And, the thought with that is that using technology like this can really start to transform and drive change in care delivery, and creates a foundation for what I believe, is a different approach to ultimately risk, but really sort of cost awareness and thinking about the way that the surgeons are making decisions in the OR, and about length of stay. Which it's very interesting to see how things change relatively quickly once there is some motivation, that fits in that. So this 4-year plan that we talked about, and focusing on the highest volume procedures, the highest cost procedures, using national benchmarks to reference to, and then getting network approval from our C-suite, which was actually, it was an easier conversation than I had thought it might be, because there was really clear benefit to both parties. And they're looking for opportunities to drive change and change the way people are thinking, and they could see how this would work. And now it's expanding across all of our surgical services. So I have a role as well as the president of our surgical executive committee, and we're using it now in general surgery, and we're expanding to OB, and they're really embracing this thought process as well. And then updating the PA comp structure, that's sort of the next part of the step. So the MD PA comp structure, both the MDs and the PAs will see this benefit in their compensation, continuing that with quarterly reviews with the entire group to say, this is where we are, this is what our goal was, we're exceeding the goal, or we're at, we need to do better. And then paying that out in the gain share, as I described. And then my hope and my intention, and I can see it already starting to happen, is that this shifts the way that all of our providers are thinking about and accounting for cost. So it's a totally different relationship. Up until now, it doesn't matter what anything costs. You just use what you want to use. And then, my overall hope with this is that we create, and these are some of the other aspects of what we're doing, but, really developing this highly reliable, standardized care delivery system. So wherever we can, and this was another aspect of things that I think is a really interesting topic that I could talk about for hours, but when we standardize care and we create consistency wherever we can, it actually makes our job so much easier, and it drives costs down. So it's another big opportunity for innovation, and using technology wherever we can, and seeking out that technology is something that I really enjoy. And like the relationship we've created with avant-garde can be extremely beneficial to the whole of healthcare delivery. The gain share, as we discussed, and then understanding and knowing how to grow and strategize growth, and using everybody to the top of their license, and facilitating that work environment really is so much more gratifying for the group. And, the way I like to joke about this is we're creating this multi-specialty, alliance that is focused on exceptional patient experience and cost mitigation, and ultimately can really be a foundation for taking risks. Because if you can create an environment where the providers are motivated to create the best possible outcome and experience, just as Codman, had envisioned for every single patient, and then understand cost, then there is no better group of people to take on risk. And that's the way that we take on this, to make a Star Wars analogy, insurance empire. So that's what I have to say. Thank you all so much, and thanks for listening.
All right. Thank you, Hans. Appreciate it. So now we'll pass it to Porter. Just you don't unmute. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Hans, for sharing your personal experiences. It's nice to hear individual experiences going through that process. Much like Hans, I created and managed a gain sharing program for about 4 years. Saw the pros and cons, the pitfalls, and also some of the great things that happened because of it. So
All right,
we
just
do,
before you jump in, if you could switch to the slideshow view.
yeah, there we go.
Perfect. Perfect.
Thank you, Derek. So I wanted to go through, just from a high level, some of the mechanics of what a gain sharing program looks like and things to think about when putting it together and how to be successful. Want to go through some of the pros and cons. How does that actually impact the surgical costs of the hospital? And then the need and the importance of using data to drive these improvements and to track everything that's going on. First and foremost, we need to have physician buy-in. And when I think about that, I think of physician autonomy, not only to opt into the program, but to feel like they can continue to operate in a manner that they see best. And then, as Susanna had mentioned, aligning the incentives with the hospitals, the clinical group, everyone that is involved to make sure we're achieving what needs to be achieved. And moving on in regards to just the data, I can't emphasize the importance enough of having ratified, relevant, and transparent data that is available at all times for all parties. Make sure that everyone is on the same page. In regards to that, want to look at something, like clinical performance feedback. As you're implementing a gain sharing program, being able to provide individual and unique data. So here's an example of performance feedback, DRG specific for an individual physician within that department, looking at case volume, costs, how they compare to other colleagues within the department. Very important to have that individualized data along with departmental data, and then being able to see how their performance is affecting the department as a whole. So looking at data and looking at what is occurring over time. This is an example of cost over time for a department, and then also seeing national benchmarks and how that's being compared. So very important to have this longitudinal, both departmental and individual data to track performance, especially on the key indicators that have been outlined in the gain sharing program. Some other items in regards to the clinical staff. We want to maintain professional judgment. We don't want any of this to be restrictive on what can be used, specifically if it's an outlier of a case. We want to do risk adjustment. Let's compare apples to apples and not have the issue of my cases are more difficult. I see a different subset of patients. And then obviously, be inclusive of all physicians. It works best if the entire department is on board, working as a team, and then also driving things individually. So in regards to looking at just a broad structure, again, we want to look at departmental implementation rather than looking at specific action items in a black box. But then incorporate both individual performance with the team performance, and the compensation can be based on that as well. One other interesting thing that I think is a bit new that is not always used, and I didn't use this when we implemented a few years back, is this idea of not resetting every single year. It's easy to say we're gonna achieve the financial improvements, we're gonna distribute, and then we reset. But some of these action items have long tails. We can see savings for years and years, and we want to be able to reward the physicians and the individuals involved in that as those savings are achieved for that greater effort that's put into place, maybe upfront in year one. And then looking at what type of target do we want to set? we suggest somewhere around a 15 to 15% target above total compensation. We don't want it to be punitive, but we do want it to be enough to incentivize the physicians to be involved with the program. This is an example of what we had. So we sorry, we got some. We've got something, but anyways, this is okay. Here we go. Apologize. That was our program. It was very involved. We wanted to create something very visual. We sat down with physicians on a month-to-month basis. We made sure they were answering all the questions regarding the data, what we were measuring, how we were measuring it. We also looked outside of just financial implications. So we were measuring research, we were measuring philanthropic work, and we had that as part of it as well. Now, once it's implemented, I think the question is, now what? Now what do we do? So we need to have joint discovery between hospital and the clinical staff, utilizing that data that we're using to track what is going on to also identify the opportunities. So below you see an example of high-level opportunities identified, supply cost, high incision to closure time, different DRGs or procedures being done, and then begin to dig into that and actually identify who can be involved, what are specific action items, and what do we want to actually target. So an example, we can target renegotiation of a particular total knee construct. Another item, do we want to create consensus statements around the use of antibiotic-infused cement? Begin to really detail that out and make sure we have a map of what we're looking at, and also being able to track that. So speaking of tracking, taking that map, who is involved, and then setting the goals. What are the goals and how do they align both with the clinical group and the administration? Putting a number on that goal. What do we project that this could actually achieve in regards to financial benefit, so that we really understand the effort being put in and what does that outcome look like? And then on a month-to-month basis, tracking the progress of that goal towards that financial benefit when looking at the financial improvements. And then taking those goals and actually monitoring the success again on a month-to-month basis. So this particular goal, $1.2 million, looking at supply costs, savings of $255,000 have been achieved year to date. What does that look like if you stretch that out 12 months? And how is everything tracking compared to what was identified by the data, the action items, and then the goal set? So from my experience, just having that transparency, that clear ability to understand who is involved, what resources are needed, and then actually tracking what is going on a month-to-month basis really makes a big difference when aligning the two groups that are involved, which is generally the hospital and the clinical group. So.
Okay. Thank you, Porter. And now off to JP.
All right. Let me just share my screen and bring this up this way. Okay. So a few comments here. Like most, I'm a victim of confirmation bias, and I'm going to share some of that with you. Some will be a bit more cynical, but it is because of the context in which I present and the environment in which I live. And 20 years ago, I was lucky enough to write an article about compensation plans before I knew anything about business. And human behavior is human behavior, and it very much is in agreement with what Susanna presented. And so our motivators don't change. So I'm going to talk about surgeon-related drivers of hospital costs. I'm going to show you some data based on work we've done with Avant-Garde Health, and then use that in context of the world in which I work and what's already been presented and some of the resistance that I've seen to implementing these changes. Now, this was a symposium we had at the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, which was organized by Steve Schutzer, and Porter was involved. And so Porter and I will be effectively presenting some of what we presented here, this was the first day of the academy, and we had, I don't know, maybe 20 people in the audience. So it gives us an opportunity to share some of what we did here. But the title of it was Co-Management and Gain Sharing is a Juice Worth the Squeeze. And so let me proceed on. I have some conflicts here, which are mainly my relationship with Avant-Garde Health. So my focus here was to look at what are the drivers of surgical costs to hospitals and ASCs, to what extent do orthopedic surgeons' decisions affect the overall hospital costs, and what are the pros and cons of gain sharing? You've already heard a lot of the pros. It's hard to find the cons. However, the organization in which I work seems to find them. Now, everybody's familiar with Peter Drucker's statement, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So that's very important because everything we do is in context of where we do it. And certain areas are more fertile than others for change. And I actually prefer the quote attributed to Al Capone, who was the gangster in Chicago. He said, "You're either at the table or on the menu." And again, Susanna showed you a slide that could kind of go along with this. So my way of looking at this in terms of alignment is that this is more of a complicated tug of war. And if you're like me, you may feel you're pulling in one direction and others are pulling in opposite directions. And this just reflects the friction we have in the system to align. So if we look at all these players here, and there are more than what Susanna showed you, let's start with the patient, first of all, who wants an outcome that's durable. We'll get to why durable is important. You, of course, you want a good outcome for your patient, but you want an income. Then the government is focused on reducing cost and controlling. The insurance companies are looking for lower cost and a profit. The implant companies have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, and so they want quality, market share, and profit, because there are sometimes conflicts related to our relationships with these players as well. And then, of course, the hospital wants cost containment, and that's not just made up. In the top 5 priorities that our CEO talked about, that was item number 5 on the list, cost containment. Quality didn't appear there. So if we look at the definition of value according to Porter and Herzlinger and others, you have to remember there's a numerator and a denominator, and we have to look at outcome over a temporal frame of reference. So over time is really important to understand who captures the value. And if the episode of care is shorter, it's very different than if it's longer. And it depends not only on that, but also in the denominator, what do you measure and how do you measure it? What's your accounting methodology? And these accounting methodologies, I believe, can vary depending on which institution you're looking at, or even which part of the institution, because I believe our outpatient surgery centers, it lends itself to an accounting methodology for TDABC that we could do, but it's much harder to do that in the main hospital setting. So if we look at the adoption curve of innovation and we look at the different players here, this is just my opinion, but where you fall on the adoption curve may be quite relevant. And I don't know if what Hans presented puts him more to the left or not, but it feels like that. But where I work feels more like I'm to the right. And understandably, large academic medical centers tend to be risk averse and move much slower to adopting any new approach, be it some kind of a compensation plan change, than others do. And this is very much evident because when you look at many of our colleagues out there who work in different settings, compensation is very important from the standpoint of what you can do within a system. So whether you're academic straight salary or fee for service, or you have an RVU model, or you're private-demic with some kind of hybrid with ownership, or maybe you're a private group or private equity is involved, or you're a large not-for-profit, et cetera, these are different contexts for what you may or may not be able to accomplish in your organization. And each of these has really different approaches. This is a really interesting article that was sent to me. I think Derek might have sent this to me. It's entitled, "Why is it so hard for academic medical centers to succeed in value-based care?" I think it's worth reading here. Academic medical centers excel in many ways, but struggle to succeed at delivering cost-effective care in value-based payment models. And much of the underperformance in places like where I work are principally due to 2 core competencies that are lacking. Number one, there's a limited ability to redesign clinical workflows. This is absolutely the case, I can tell you, after 27 years working at a main hospital. And the inability or unwillingness to change the economic relationships with specialists. Now, interestingly, as our organization is becoming a new entity called Mass General Brigham, the compensation plan is changing. And I don't think we have time to talk about that here, but certainly it's changing, but maybe more to one side of the graph that Susanna showed than others. The key factors that play a role here are the electronic medical records that lock in existing work patterns, the compensation systems that reward volume over value, the organizational structure that is problematic for change management, and complex and somewhat poor accounting systems that are difficult to analyze. So Evan O'Donnell did a nice study in collaboration with Avant-Garde using their automated approach, just looking at the cost drivers in a very commonly performed procedure, rotator cuff repairs. And over 600 procedures were evaluated by 13 physicians who were shoulder or sports surgeons at our 2 academic medical centers. And we measured cost using TD-ABC measurement techniques. And what we found was that the cost varied by 6x. Intraoperative costs were 91% of the entire episode from pre-op to post-op. The major cost drivers were biological adjuncts and surgeon preference that was idiosyncratic. While there were additional cost drivers of tendon retraction and fatty atrophy and these kinds of things that orthopedic surgeons will know what I'm talking about, they weren't the major drivers, and not associated with cost was the patient age or comorbidities, or actually the number of tendons that were torn that needed to be repaired. And this is a nice target that demonstrates for you the outliers in terms of overall cost for the 624 patients. And you can see the high cost patients are clearly identified in this graphic. And what I don't have for you is actual margin effect, which you can imagine who's losing money and who's making money and what the opportunities are that exist here if you scale this over the entire book of business that the organization does. It's an opportunity. Now, if you wonder, where is this sort of thing possible? If you look at the University of Utah, they have a program called UP, which basically is the hospital acting as a VC for departments, including orthopedics, that create cost-effective solutions. And they share in a co-management model with the department. They do so not so much for physician revenue, but for resources returned to the department to fulfill the mission. And for me, that's a major problem at our institution. We have a lot of mandates without the resources to accomplish these mandates, and this would be one way certainly to be able to solve that problem. The other thing I was interested in is what's the size of the book of business of orthopedics? And at our institution, if you look at outpatient and inpatient, just over 1 month here, we constituted 26% of all of the procedures done, and clearly that was the largest of all of the departments. Now, the problem is, like most academic departments, there is a shortfall here, and you can see in blue is the cash from operations, and in the red is the operating expenses. And every year, magically, it seems that things zero out. But why is it that we have it like this? And the reason is we're using a model that simply doesn't work. Lately, as you know, after the pandemic came on into play, and this was a study that we did in collaboration with Avant-Garde, we started doing outpatient arthroplasty. The CMS approved this, and you can see by quarter the growth, significant growth. And we published on this and did a review of the safety. It's significant safety and significant cost savings. And actually, what's interesting is if you look at the CMS reimbursement from 2020 to 2021, what's interesting to see is that the outpatient reimbursement for shoulder arthroplasty went up, admittedly significantly lower than the inpatient, but the reimbursement to physicians went down. And this is overall not necessarily reflective of what we're getting paid at our institution, but nonetheless, this is again a inconsistency that may play a role in what Susanna presented in terms of burnout. I went further than this, and I wanted to look at our outpatient experience and how efficient we were in the outpatient center versus the main hospital. And for this, I had advisors from Harvard Business School when I was there, including someone who's an expert in forensic accounting. And so when we looked at everything that we did by body part and specialty, by volume, the largest contributor was the hand service because they did high volume, rapid cases, et cetera. But when we looked at RVUs in terms of the major RVUs and using that as a surrogate for actual payments, it was actually the shoulder service that contributed the largest book of business. Now, that's important to understand because in our system for a period of time, we had a different payment scale in the outpatient center versus the main hospital. And so where you distribute your cases and do them may actually result in different payments for service. And that's worthwhile considering when you allocate resources and capacity for different services. Now, when we looked at the overall numbers here, and of course I redacted this, what was interesting to see in the outpatient center is the average profit over the time period that we reviewed this was 38%, which is quite remarkable. And that's without any kind of co-management and gain sharing. And the average per case profit was 38% as well. What's interesting is if we drill down into two areas in sports medicine, let's say ACL surgery, you can see that the case here in green, physician E, is the most cost effective, and that individual did 83 cases. But the least cost effective was a total of 2.3x higher for the same procedure. So that's an opportunity waiting to be explored from the standpoint of effect on the bottom line. It's even worse in rotator cuff repair, and this was actually worse than what O'Donnell published. You can see that the variation by surgeon here, each of these letters is a surgeon, of course, is almost 8x. Again, that is a tremendous opportunity that's going by the wayside that could be addressed. If we look at key performance indicators, it's very easy to look at these numbers here. And for example, look at percent of time as turnover in the main hospital, which you can see on the upper line, and then in our outpatient surgery center in orthopedics. And then you can compare us to the other services, and the percent block time utilization has to do with capacity management. And that's another opportunity that we could influence. And if you look here again at on-time case starts and turnover in terms of time in each of these centers, you know immediately which is the most efficient. The question is, why can't we change in other centers? What are the barriers to this? And it seems to me that alignment would be one way to move in the right direction here. So at the end of the day, in my way of thinking, it's simply about the carrot or the stick. And for the most part, I feel that the carrot existed more in the outpatient center when we started that, and the stick has remained more the case of motivation in our hospital facility. Thank you.
Thank you, JP, and thank you so much also to Susanna and Hans and Porter. So now we're going to do a little bit of discussion in Q&A. I guess from a quick time check perspective, JP, would it be reasonable, say if we went for about 10 minutes at this point, or how much time would you?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Most of the people that remain here, and there's still a significant number, are interested in this topic. I don't want to short them on it. And for those who have to leave, again, this is recorded and it'll be posted anyway. You can watch it later. So have at it.
Cool. So I'll start with a question for the group, but if people have questions they're interested in, please chat those in, and we'll turn to those after I ask a question first. And so the question I have to start with is, recognizing many people on here listening are physicians themselves, what one piece of advice would each of you have for a physician who's interested in trying to put in place one of these types of financial alignment structures with their organization that they work for? How would you suggest they go about getting started? And maybe we can start and just Susanna and go through people in the order which they spoke.
Yeah, well, really quickly, I think this covers a lot of what I introduced with my initial talk. I think that if you want to institute a different type of compensation or start to look into changing the ways that compensation is designed and administered in your organization, you need to start thinking about, first and foremost, what do you want to accomplish? And so if you can find, you cannot find alignment if you don't have a direction. So I think it's very important to have clarity on what the ultimate goal of that compensation plan needs to be. Many organizations, if it is perfectly okay if your organization decides that you want to maximize revenue, that is a valid objective. You can choose whether that's a good objective for your organization or not, or if you want to prioritize other things. But until you know what you want to prioritize, it's really difficult to start talking about the compensation structure.
Thanks. Turn to Hans.
So my advice would be, this was important to me before presenting this to the system to try to get a decision about it, was to have an extremely well-baked plan, so that we had thought thoroughly about how this would be implemented, over what time frame, exactly how much we would aim to gain share, and before putting it in front of anybody, because I felt like that was the way that we could control, the decision that would get made. And lo and behold, they really liked our plan because it looked good for them, just like it looked good for us. And I think that helped a lot. I think if we had gone to them and said, well, we think we want to do a gain share, well, then we've lost the ability to drive what that plan becomes. So.
Okay, thank you. Porter or JP?
Yeah.
Porter, you go ahead.
Yeah, Hans, I think that's interesting. When we went through that process, once we decided what we were aligning on and wanted to accomplish, as we were going through it, we made sure that we had the CEO and the CFO at every internal meeting. So it was the clinical staff and high-level executives. Obviously we had a plan as well, but we found it super important for everyone just to be in lockstep as we're going through the process. We probably spent a little longer. We spent about 6 months going through meetings and tweaking and discussing and really defining what we wanted to do. But having that core steering committee to analyze, review, and then be part of the implementation group was very important to make it successful.
Just a comment on my end. We have some people from our organization here, and as this organization is changing into what is now known as MGB, this may be an opportunity for alignment and moving in the right direction. Lord knows we have case examples of how well that can work. Personally, I think culture can change along with the organization in a favorable way that benefits the physicians and the organization. This is an opportunity, and the time is right to take advantage and not ignore that situation. In fact, the compensation plan has moved exactly in the opposite direction, and Susanna pointed that out. And I think we now have issues of burnout and et cetera that are going to be problematic if we don't move in the right direction. I know Bob Kaplan's on here, and at least I want to call out Bob because years ago, Bob and I and others from the value-based care group had a collaboration with one of the local insurers to do exactly this, have a value-based payment model that would incentivize outcomes and guarantee those outcomes, just as Codman would have done. And we went to leadership of our organization, admittedly different leadership than what we have now, and it was crickets after that. And, it's wonderful to see how things are working elsewhere. It's disappointing to see how they're not working where I am. And at the end of the day, I think there's a message here that can be carried back to leadership of our organization that now's the right time to make these changes since they're working elsewhere. Bob, any comment on that? I know you're on here with us.
No, you're bringing back a little bit of a sad memory because we had many meetings starting early in the morning for my time, late for a surgeon, but and we hammered out the plan, as you said, between the surgeons and the insurer. They were willing to take a chance on a bundle payment, and he visited the CFO, and he had no interest in it. So that was discouraging. But we got to write one paper about it.
Okay. Well, so yeah, thanks for sharing those thoughts. And then, again, if people have questions, feel free to chat them in. One other question, I guess, for discussion would be, there's a lot of discussion here around physician-hospital financial alignment. How do people think about like these same principles apply to other roles inside the organization as well? In what circumstances would you think it makes sense for other clinical or administrative staff to have similar types of incentives around strong financial management?
Who do you want to direct that to, Derek?
Anybody. Floor is open.
Fifth on that. Nobody wants to take that question. So go ahead.
I will. I'm a strong proponent of collective performance metrics. So healthcare, more than many other professions, is a team sport. And so if we don't include the administrators and the non-physicians and everybody else that works in the organization if we want to talk about alignment, we need to align everyone. And so for me, if you are not there to contribute to the ultimate goal of the organization, why are you there in the first place? So we have to assume that everybody has a role to play. I really love that short story of, when President Kennedy went to NASA to visit the facilities and asked a janitor that was sweeping the floor what his job was. And his answer was, I'm putting a man on the moon. And this is the kind of mentality that we want to have, right? Everybody has a role to play in the ultimate, to achieve the ultimate strategic goal. So I'm a big fan of incentivizing everybody for collective performance.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, I mean, the corollary in business is stock options, and that's not something that we've figured out a way to do in health systems. But I think that, CEO compensation and C-suite compensation in other industries is very much tied to the performance of the organization. And we need to start to think that way. That's what this finds a foundation in for me is, this is the performance of the group and the performance of us as a team. And I think at every level, it should be tied to the compensation. Absolutely. I think part of the way that it was presented on my end.
Yeah.
Just.
Yeah, I'm pretty much done.
Sorry, go ahead, Hans.
No problem. Just to sort of close the loop on the way that it was presented to leadership in my system is, and having a fully sort of baked plan. And I think that the reason that worked is because they had already bought into the way that I had managed some other pieces of the department and collaboratively changing alignment in the culture on standardization and driving costs down in those ways. And I think part of the way that it was sold was, this is how I feel that we need to compensate the group for the collective efforts that are being made to drive high reliability to the way that we're doing things and making decisions both clinically and financially.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that the idea of this compensation, I mean, in the end, it's all financially compensated. One thing I would suggest is, sure, the financial health of the institution is very important, but layering in additional items as part of that model, whether that be research, outcomes. As I mentioned, we had metrics for education, we had metrics for philanthropic work. We wanted, for our incentive structure and what we wanted out of it, it was more than simply just cost. And so that came over time. But I think it is important to also look at what else is important to the department in regards to metrics that want to be achieved outside of just simply the financial component.
Thank you, Porter, and thank you so much to Susanna and to Hans and to JP as well. I think that concludes the first section here this evening, and turn over to Ira and JP if we want to do a quick break or move on to the second section.
I think maybe moving on is probably a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
Given the hour, so people probably, depending what time zone they're in, they probably want to move along, and we have their attention now. So let's move forward.
All right, so we're going to go on to the next section, which is value in orthopedics, shoulder care. That's about time we hit the shoulder topic. Where is it? We're going to start with Srikumaran, professor of orthopedics at Johns Hopkins. You're available to share your slides? Okay, let's.
Thanks JP, Derek, Ira, for organizing. It's great to be here. So we'll shift gears here a little bit and talk about a different kind of green. So my goals today or tonight are to really quickly go from big concepts and lofty ideas like sustainability all the way down now to a very small area, or our area of sphere of influence as it relates to implants, specifically for rotator cuff repair. Ultimately, I will try to convince you, while the problems we face are large, it's not actually that hard to be green. So first, who cares? I know JP cares. He's been talking about value for a long time, and he's inspired a lot of us to do the same. Dr. Mattson has also been a proponent and gave a great talk at the 2018 ASES meeting. It was actually the Ernest Codman lecture about consideration of these green techniques. I'd highly encourage everyone to view that if they haven't had the opportunity. And so Americans care too about these green concepts, and increasingly so. While there's still a partisan split, it's a rare issue where there's actually any type of majority opinion. People on both sides now believe climate change is happening. 8 out of 10 Americans believe it, that it's driving extremes in weather. That we also feel that the government's not doing enough, and particularly young Americans, including Republicans. So Americans do care and feel support for all the policies that are coming forth internationally, nationally, as well as locally. And even 95% of healthcare providers specifically see sustainability as morally necessary. So we do care, but why do we care? I mean, I think it's obvious as our way of life is at risk with global warming. It's increasingly difficult to ignore changes in the season, more severe weather events, fires, floods, droughts. And this also affects our health. There's an estimated loss of 470,000 daily adjusted life years from US healthcare related pollution. The World Health Organization characterizes climate change as the greatest risk to public health in this century. And because of healthcare itself, it's sort of a self-feeding cycle. The US in 2022, we were the second largest contributor to worldwide greenhouse gas emissions behind China. And per capita, the average US citizen is responsible for nearly twice as much climate pollution as the average Chinese citizen. So this green wave is coming, or it's already here, with 77% of people aiming to live a bit more sustainably. Healthcare is under pressure now to reduce its environmental impact. The medical industry specifically is a significant waste contributor and is lacking in a lot of sustainable interventions or solutions. So we see this internationally with the recent Dubai Climate Accord and unprecedented call to transition away from fossil fuels. We see it nationally, new EPA regulations, and we even see it locally in my own counties and nationally in all kinds of different restaurants and institutions banning plastic goods. Now, specifically, plastics and single-use items are of growing concern. So the world, and we continue to learn about these dangers in terms of living with and around plastics. We see these almost every day now, something new about how plastics affects our life. And critics have really called out sort of a fraud over whether we can even do something about it or whether it's sustainable in any form. So let's quickly go from climate change in general to our own sphere of control with just a few facts. So US healthcare produces more than 4 million tons of waste a year. We have 9% of all greenhouse gases are produced by the US healthcare system. 25% of hospital waste is directly from the operating room, from surgical procedures, and single-use plastics constitute 25% of all healthcare waste. And then using reusable products in the operating room can decrease OR waste by 65%. We also see this sort of green wave in our own publications. We see many of these are all after 2020, talking about reuse of equipment, operating room waste, and being environmentally sustainable. So just quickly to summarize some of these concepts that were talked about in these papers, there are many solutions ranging from reuse, refurbishing, repurposing, reducing. Reuse of product is one solution instead of single-use plastics and kits with each case. And there's technology now with various companies that provide this. There's companies that have gone away from anchors completely, and there's reusable versions of this. And we've had this for a long time, and several of our suture passers are exactly constructed this way. So many old products already work this way, and there's new technologies coming in terms of sterilization to reduce and remove blue wrap and improve on our ability to make use of reusable instrumentation. In terms of the carbon footprint, single-use devices were often the largest offenders, and switching to reusable items could reduce the footprint by more than 50%. In one case, University of Washington eliminated 5.8 tons of waste in a single year by reusing single-use devices. There's also significant ethical benefits. There's broader access for low-income areas. Principles of justice and beneficence are respected. And the financial benefits, $1.78 million were saved in a single year just by reusing undamaged drill bits, 200,000 just by reusing tourniquets. Reusing external fixators saved 32% in costs. But there are significant barriers to adoption, and these typically relate to concerns about patient safety, exposure to unknown liability risk. There's a lack of quality control metrics, helping people and institutions guide them on what's appropriate in terms of what can be reused and what cannot. So we care, it matters to us, but we often hear this is too big of a problem. I can't make a difference. So for that sentiment, I would submit to you, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. So we've talked a little bit about going from this large concept all the way to rotator cuff anchors, and we can measure this. The current pandemic in sports medicine is the reliance on these disposable instruments and the increased costs associated with it, storage issues, while being ultimately less sustainable. And again, it constitutes 25% of healthcare waste. So this work sought to directly compare the carbon footprint of waste disposal for single-use versus reusable instrumentation for rotator cuff repair, specifically a cost analysis, looking at waste mass as well as waste management cost. Not surprising, the reusable system had the lowest total mass and the lowest total volume, which has implications for the front end for inventory size, as well as the back end in terms of waste disposal. So clearly the reusable system also had the lowest carbon emissions. And lastly, that translated to having the lowest medical waste costs. So for properly sorted medical waste, the cost can be 10 times as high for regulated waste. So anything that touches the medical surgical field. We also know that the specific system is safe and reliable with respect to outcomes without any difference in infection rates or to historic controls. So I thought we'd end and kind of go back to our sort of bigger ideas and being green. So what does this mean exactly? I don't really think it means you have to be an ardent environmentalist. Maybe you just don't like to waste. And we talked a lot about money already and compensation. I think we can all get behind that. But green is really about value in some of those concepts that Dr. Mattson introduced in just very simple graph. But I would suggest that we need to consider a third dimension as it relates to sustainable innovations and techniques. We can still respect patient outcomes, achieve low costs, and still benefit our patients equally while also taking care of the environment. So if we consider the balance between society's interest, patient interest with our economic limitations, I think that's where value lives. But if we also consider humanity in general and our environment, that's really where sustainability lives. So we see a lot of companies continuing to pursue disposable instrumentation, lots of plastics waste. And, while that might be the majority, it doesn't mean it's the correct thing to do. So I would suggest it's really not that hard to be green. There's a lot of it going on already. You can just start within your own sphere of influence with a very small procedure. You can surround and align yourself with like-minded individuals, practices, industry partners. You can pick one area, and if you're able to measure it, share the results, spread the word, and then repeat. So I like this proverb a lot, and I think it kind of summarizes what we're talking about. We don't need to lament about what wasn't done in the past, but we can simply start. Thank you.
All right. That was a great talk. We're going to have a lot of questions on that. I'm absolutely sure. Andrew Jawa is Boston Sports and Shoulder Center, New England Baptist Hospital, and Beth Israel Lahey Health. Andy, take it away.
Great. Uma, that was a great talk. Really thought-provoking. I'm going to be talking about value in shoulder arthroplasty. All I do is shoulder replacements. I'm the chief of shoulder arthroplasty at the New England Baptist, and this is really a case study in, sorry, let me go backwards here. A case study with Avant-Garde on time-driven activity-based costing. It really started about 5 years ago. We'll go into some of the nuts and bolts of some of the stuff that was talked about earlier. So to me, these are my conflicts, highly relevant. I get paid by an implants company in royalties, and I'm an owner of an outpatient surgery center. Two things I'm going to be talking about in great detail. So do shoulder arthroplasties affect value, the implants? So we'll talk about time-driven activity-based costing, what it is. Dr. Kaplan's here, talk about this case study with New England Baptist, ambulatory surgery centers, and the outcomes, the numerator of this of value. So value and time-driven activity-based costing. So we all know this, value is outcomes over cost, and time-driven activity-based costing is really the gold standard for cost, defining it as Dr. Kaplan has figured out. This is a busy slide, but it basically shows that, you know, it's very complicated to figure out the process maps, the algorithms for which patients go through, and each individual cost. This is timed, unfortunately. So let me see if I can change that. And so it's very complicated to do that. And it takes a lot of expertise. In this case, that expertise comes from Avant-Garde Health. They have no disclosures with Avant-Garde Health, except they've helped me publish a lot of papers and see really good data. So the first thing that we saw was that when we got this data from Avant-Garde Health, this is what it looked like. For each individual surgeon, this is how much it costs to do a shoulder arthroplasty. This is me on the left, and all the other shoulder arthroplasty surgeons on the right. I'm certainly not the most cost effective, but we really wanted to break down what are the drivers of cost. And this led to our first paper. And what we discovered was pretty striking. I really didn't know this. The main driver for cost was the implant cost. So on the left is anatomic, and on the right is reverse shoulder arthroplasty. And that big blue is implant cost. The second thing, the purple, is personnel costs within the OR. Everything else, secondary. That was eye-opening to me. I really didn't know that. And that led us to sort of say, hey, how much does hospital length of stay cost? You know, everybody's like, get patients out of the hospital. It's going to be cheaper. And it is, but certainly nowhere near implant costs, maybe 10, 15% per day. Implant costs way more. That led us to then say, well, all right, is this maybe just shoulder arthroplasty, or is this all implants? And so we looked at this, and I'm sorry, this is timed for some reason, so I'll try and figure that out as I go. But we looked at the cases that had the most volume. So total knee, greatest volume, both at our institution and sort of globally. Total hip, next, and total elbow, the least amount. And it's very interesting when you look, total knee has the lowest implant cost per episode of care and the lowest cost overall. RSA, reverse shoulder arthroplasty, had really high implant cost and sort of proportional to, sorry about that, to the whole episode of cost. While total ankle is relatively uncommon, and that implant cost was the highest. So there does seem to be a general proportionality to how often this procedure is done sort of nationally and globally in the episode of cost and implant cost. So how does that affect profit margin? So we were able to go back and say, okay, how much were we paid for each episode of care in these individual cases, and how did the cost of the episode of care affect our profit margins? And this was done with Eric Smith, who was on one of these talks earlier. And this was fascinating. So it did seem to relate. So total knee, which had the lowest episode of cost, had the greatest profit margin. Total ankle, which was high cost, had a very low profit margin, and reverse shoulder arthroplasty had the least profit margin, because we really weren't being paid that much more, even though the implant cost was much larger. So that was really eye-opening as well, getting to sort of the granular details of how much is an episode of care and how much we're making as an institution for this. And again, this is inpatient. Then we said, hey, well, maybe this is just at the Baptist and it's not at other institutions. So maybe higher volume places do better. So we worked with other facilities that use Avant-Garde, so Rothman and Gunderson. We said, well, maybe if they're higher volume, they're more efficient and they're lower cost. totally wrong. And if you look at hospital B, we actually don't have that actual cost. We have the index cost. Hospital B had the highest volume and the highest cost per case. Why is that? Well, maybe lots of hypotheses, but maybe people who are at the cutting edge do the highest volume, use the most expensive implants. And when we sort of broke this down, one thing came out in the regression analysis: implant, implant, implant. Whatever implant you use in a total shoulder, that by far outweighed everything else. So this was really interesting. And co-management, we talked about this earlier, became instituted at the Baptist. And that's a collaboration of surgeons and administrators to share gain sharing of any costs that we could have. So there's nothing better than putting competitive surgeons together and showing them their data. So this is the data. So these were our hip and knee surgeons who had monthly co-management meetings and said, hey, you are, and their names were there. This is you. This is how much you cost. This is how surgeon B, C, D, totally transparent. And people did not want to be the highest cost surgeon. So that led us to say, okay, look at all this variation in gray. That gray was the cost of implant. And I know a lot of facilities are going with one vendor, Zimmer, DePuy, whatever, and they get the best cost. But what they decided to do at the Baptist was do reference pricing. Say, hey, everybody can be here, DePuy, Zimmer, Stryker, just meet this low level of cost. And we were able to bring the cost down. Why? Because you got surgeons to buy in and they got some money out of that gain sharing. Now, that was great. The problem with this, and this alludes to what we talked about earlier, is it was a one-time thing. So I got a couple checks for this, but then all the savings that the BILH got from this, they moved it to Winchester, they moved it to BIDMC, they used these same reference pricing. We didn't get any of that. So the problem is sometimes there's a little bit of a bait and switch. And sometimes there's this first mover effect where you make some money early, but there's nothing else to cut down the road. And so I know Porter was talking about that, making that sustainable. That's one of the issues with gain sharing. You need to make it sustainable. The changing market, moving to ambulatory surgery centers. So this has been alluded to in the past, but one way surgeons are moving away from just being laborers is having other streams of passive income. I'm in a private academic institution. I can do this. And again, I'm sorry, this keeps advancing. And so CMS now has allowed for Medicare to be done at outpatient surgery center, not hospital-based surgery centers, but ambulatory surgery centers. And so that has changed the nature of what we do. And so I do a lot more as an outpatient. So you say, well, it's going to be cheaper to do it as an outpatient. And the reality is, using TD-ABC, Suren and Namdari show this, it's actually not. It's almost the same as doing it as an inpatient, maybe driven mainly by implant. So overall to society, Medicare is paying less, but the cost to the institution is not less. And so that money is just going to a different person, or less of it's going to them. Now, maybe it's better because it's going to the surgeon and there's some gain sharing there. But it is interesting because the question is, where is this money going to? Is this a race to the bottom? And the short answer is it is completely, because this is only going to last for so long until reimbursement for a total shoulder as an ASC is going to drop, as we've seen in total hips and total knees. Now, we've talked a lot about cost, but we don't often talk about the other side of the equation in terms of outcomes. And the reason is we're extremely poor at looking at outcomes in the US. There's really very little incentive to do that. And, one of the fundamentals of value-based healthcare, as the leaders on this call have shown us, is that you need to follow, in this case, hip, knee, shoulder. You have to follow outcome through the whole cycle of care. And if you look, it's to mortality, or up top, reoperation or revision. The problem is reoperation or revision for our total shoulders 10, 15, 20 years. We really don't follow that. And so value really cannot be calculated unless we have that, outcome or that numerator. We can look at other places like the Australian registry, which interestingly, they follow all their outcomes because it's one healthcare payer, which we don't have here. But we can see that things that are more expensive, like a total shoulder, or less expensive, have less good outcomes than things that might be more expensive, like pyrocarbon or RSA. But we don't have that outcome data here, but we can rely on others to show us that. But there's new technology, and maybe JP will be talking about this, that it's hard to look at that, like navigation. Here's another example of non-cross-link poly versus cross-link poly, which we can look at the Australian registry that shows, hey, more expensive products actually benefit. So in summary, total shoulder implants affect value. TDABC has impact. We do have difficulty measuring outcomes, and the move to ASCs really has changed this equation completely. I apologize because there was timing, which I don't believe I had, but sorry about that. But thank you. Hopefully I brought up some interesting points for discussion.
Great. So let me move to another topic to what'll finish off this session, and that is the shiny new things we call digital technology. And Andy hit it right on the head. What are we looking for? What do we think it's going to do? Why is it going to be better? And this presentation is going to be a bit of a teaser to see what industry is thinking and what they're doing, and what do we think? What do we think as surgeons? It's certainly going to change as we get more data, and the growth of information is going to be exponential because, of course, AI is part of this. I have a number of conflicts here. I'm not really going to talk about any particular devices or anything else. Technology I'll talk about a bit, and I'll identify where I have a conflict. So it was Charlie Neer, who's on the left, who said shoulder arthroplasty gives good pain relief and function with durable results in thoughtful, capable hands. And he had no technology like we have now. If you look at these two leaders in shoulder arthroplasty, and you could do this in any area of specialization, and you'll have disagreements. One of them on the left is Gilles Walsh, who says, I believe in planning. And the other one on the right is Mark Frankel, and he never plans. And so the question is, what's the evidence and what's the eminence? And much of what we use as our justification is listening to experts and their eminence or their opinions rather than the evidence that's actually provided. And Andy pointed out the value of a registry in another country can be very, very important in terms of what we can report. Rick Mattson, who was mentioned previously, is one of the founders of the American Shoulder Elbow Surgeons. And, he wrote an article entitled What I've Learned Over My Career. And what's interesting is he's a little bit comes across as an anti-technology person. He thinks that computed CT scans are rarely necessary, and it's not really necessary to correct the deformities that we spend so much time thinking about. As opposed to this, Christian Gerver believes in planning, even when it was two-dimensional, like you see in this X-ray, and he said the result is never better than the plan, which is actually true. Codman, my opinion is, Codman would have wanted digital tools because Codman always wanted to see if something was better that would work. And Gerber always said, do the operation in your mind before you do it in the patient. And this cartoon here that some of you may have seen is the reason why Codman was asked to leave the Mass General. Shows an ostrich kicking out golden eggs to the physicians with his head buried in the sand, which is a lot of what we see nowadays when we incentivize volume over real value. Now, again, the concept of value and the value equation you've already seen. It's over time in terms of the amount of money. But the key is, with these new technologies, how is this managed in terms of the cost that we're now applying to the episode of care, which Andy was so clear on in terms of the implant. Now we have a new approach here, and I'm going to share with you what industry thinks about this, and surgeons really aren't thinking about it much. So, what does industry want? What do surgeons want? And what do the patients want? And the patients are somewhat agnostic, although you're going to see, direct consumer driven thinking because people will see things on the internet and then come wanting certain things. So if we look at the kind of what Susan said before, which is going from what you really want to achieve and working backwards, we'd like shorter learning curves with fewer complications. We'd like reduced errors in the planning before we go to surgery that result in wrong surgery and a wrong plan. It actually would be great if we could reduce errors in surgical execution by engineering error avoidance. And some of that's already available in other parts of the body in terms of robotics, and improving the constructs for better biomechanics that result in more durability. And Andy showed you some examples of this, because when we look at an episode of care that's very short, just the episode of the day of surgery, we're not talking about what the patient captures over time. And what's fascinating is the surgeon in the hospital have a 90-day global payment period, after which all the rest of the value, technically speaking, is captured by the patient alone. So if it costs us more for our episode or our part of it than what the patient gets in terms of durability, what is the ethics of that in terms of paying more to give the patient a longer, more durable outcome? And then, of course, the patient experience. So this is what I'm talking about. If you look at the patient's perception of their outcome and process of recovery, here's the early episode of care, and Andy had measured some of this, and for sure the cost of the implant's important. But the rest of this, the durability, is captured by the patient. And these are just different curves for recovery from the patient point of view, their subjective shoulder value over time. Now, I want to share with you some interesting data. This is from the Orthopedic Industry Annual Report from a consulting group called OrthoWorld that I'm told is pretty valid. And I want to share with you the overall spend in orthopedics. First of all, the global spend in orthopedic sales in 2023 was over $57 billion, with a percent growth year over year from the last year of 3.5%. Now, what of that is relevant to us, what I'm talking about here now? If you break this down into the orthopedic product segments, you can see the joint replacement drives most of the cost. But extremities is about almost not quite $3 billion, of which probably half of that or so is shoulder arthroplasty. What's interesting is if you look at enabling technology, what I'm going to talk about here, and enabling technology is, you guessed it, surgical planning, robotics, navigation, patient monitoring, etc. That's only 2.1% of the global spend, and it's growing a little bit faster than the overall growth rate of the market itself, but not as fast as you would imagine. So if we now consider this from the standpoint of a digital episode of care, looking at this technology, and in white is what we usually would do, that is eyeballing or 2D qualitative assessment, generic guides, this kind of standard operating procedures, you can see the different kinds of technologies that may be available now and coming in the future. And frankly, we're also missing the possibility of bending the learning curve with simulation in advance of doing the surgery to increase the skill set and reduce the errors that surgeons would otherwise make. But to be fair, that's not, as you'll see in a moment, a big value for industry. So when we look at things like immersive virtual reality, disrupting surgical education, it was actually William Mayo who said there's no excuse today for the surgeon to learn on the patient, and yet look at that operating room. That's how people would learn. And frankly, there are a number of companies trying to survive here, creating this. And it's been tough sledding for all of them, frankly, because, as I'll show you in a moment, industry and the exact formula for how this is scaled isn't worked out. If you look here, you realize that virtually every company has some kind of virtual planning tool. Well, what do surgeons think about this, and what does industry think about it, and how is it sustainable in the future? Well, we have articles that show indirect benefit. For example, patient-specific planning actually has the greatest impact in surgical decision-making on low-volume surgeons. And those are individuals who do less surgery than others. And frankly, the more they do this, the more they make decisions like high-volume surgeons, which you would think would be good for the patient. Joe Ionati, who's a leader in this area, demonstrated that we reduce outliers when we place components in a more optimum position using patient-specific planning and guides. And you can see the scatter plot here that's quite different than what you do if you did it with your eyeball. And navigation is a popular thing that's being used now, but to what degree is that changing the outcomes and the durability? We don't know yet about that. So there are a lot of initials here: augmented reality, mixed reality. What are these? Augmented reality is augmenting the real world with referencing, like you see here with intravenous placement. And virtual reality is bringing the virtual world into the real world and using it as an adjunct or a tool to navigate. Robots are coming. Well, actually, robots are here, and in the shoulder are coming in the next several years, one coming this year and some next year. And, you know, this has a total different business model than some of the other tools. But what's really interesting is that all of these major players in this area are already collaborating with orthopedic industry and many other industries for that matter in scaling these technologies. And frankly, this has been called the fourth revolution, particularly when you talk about artificial intelligence. And I'll talk on prioritization here in a moment. So it was Steve Jobs who said everyone here has a sense that right now is one of those moments when we're influencing the future. But what does industry think and what do surgeons think right now? And how is that going to change? And that will be largely driven by how successful the industry is in terms of its revenue model and its responsibility to return a value to shareholders and the adoption of surgeons. So what I did, which I haven't presented yet, this is the first time I'm presenting this, is I did a surgeon survey that looked at not quite 200 surgeons across the European and American specialty for shoulder, and also the Codman Society. And then I did a blinded questionnaire or survey for 9 industry players in this area, of which 6 responded. 3 did not, and that's, of course, not surprising. I don't know which of the industry players actually responded. I have kind of an idea, but not for sure. So I'm going to show you first what do surgeons think. If you look at these surgeons, the different colors are the different societies, with the American Society being in red and the European Society in green. And you can see most individuals who are members of these organizations define themselves as shoulder surgeons, although we have others as well. If you look at how many years in practice, it's a pretty broad experience across the board, although most by a fair bit have been in practice more than 20 years. If you look what percentage of their practice is shoulder arthroplasty, because of course we do other things, it's kind of between 10 and 50%. And if you look at how many shoulder placements that most do per year, then it certainly favors the high volume, where most indicate that they do more than 40 per year. That's a very important threshold in terms of complications, and that's work that Avant-Garde and our research group have done from the Codman Society, demonstrating that this is directly correlated to revision surgery. We asked people, do you do preoperative planning? And of course, in this expert group, the vast majority do, but there's some real confusion about what they think they're doing and what they're actually doing, as I'll show you in a moment. Do you use preoperative digital tools? And the answer is yes for most of them. And then if you use tools, you know, what are you using? So what's fascinating is if you look here, they say, well, virtual reality, that's the smaller group. Many people say I do other things. Well, the problem is, and this is sort of each of these words reflects the number of answers for what they use. You can see the larger print is what they use mostly, which really belongs in the virtual planning category, even though they put it in the other category. So I think they're confused about what that is. And you can see some of the other planning tools that are used from different companies as well. So most do virtual planning, but don't really understand what the hell it is. Do you use any of the following digital technology to execute your plan in the operating room? So what kind of tools do we use at all here? And what's fascinating is that most surgeons are really using a single disposable item, which is some kind of a patient-specific guide, or in some instances, guides that are reusable, rather than digital tools. The guides are created from the digital planning, and those are the ones that people are mostly using, but we haven't yet replaced them with things like navigation and robotics, etc. Will that happen is yet to be determined. What is your expectation now of how the technology will help you in the future? And the overwhelming winner here is AI. And, you know, if you look here for the other category, people have different ideas about how AI is going to help them, but nobody knows for sure. And you can see that following this is navigation and augmented reality and other things that I think, frankly, people are largely confused about. And what would you like to see coming from industry is an important one that industry would want to know. And overwhelmingly, it's artificial intelligence and machine learning. Though, again, there's some confusion here in terms of what that is. And that's followed by improved VR planning and navigation, etc. Okay. Do you think there's a need for post-operative management tools in digital, in terms of digital tools that can be used? And what's interesting here is that's significantly the case, with upwards of 70% of physicians wanting that. Yet, as I'll show you, that's not really a priority of industry. And frankly, if you ask them, what do you want to have in the post-operative period in managing patients, the number one is some kind of a post-operative recovery app-based approach. And then you have all these other things like wearables and digital analysis of range of motion and et cetera, which yet to have to be sorted out by what industry might provide and what surgeons might want. So if we look now at the companies and ask them these questions, here's question number one. What are your company's priorities for development and application of digital healthcare in shoulder arthroplasty? And again, you can see there's alignment. Artificial intelligence and machine learning is number one, followed by navigation and then mixed reality and et cetera. If you follow that along and then you say, well, how do you think that this will create value? Then understandably, industry believes this will reduce errors, and I think surgeons probably believe that as well, but we have yet to document that that's the case. Will it change and move the less experienced surgeons into the category of more experienced surgeons with less complications and less reoperations? And the second value point is going to be creating data and further information that informs best practices in decision-making, potentially predicting what happens if you do one thing versus another thing. Improved efficiency, et cetera, are other options. And when you try to get answers from industry in particular, I took a few comments from each of them. They're rather kind of non-specific comments about under-evaluation or preoperative planning with AI or whatever. It's not really that focused. And frankly, I thought for a minute, I better ask industry what their priorities are in terms of who they're focusing on. And this might surprise you a bit to see that shareholders are at the bottom of the list. And you should at least take note of the fact, the surgeons that remain on this call, that you're actually the highest priority, coming slightly above patients, largely because patients require you to tell them the value of the technology. And then actually the one that may be paying for this, which Andy pointed out, is a hospital. And there seem to be less focus because perhaps the surgeons and the patients will drive this. It's not entirely clear yet. So this is really interesting. When you ask them about the revenue model for artificial intelligence, virtually everybody else says other. And this includes under-evaluation, unknown at present, et cetera. And so one of the concerns I have is, how will AI scale when there's no clear revenue model for it in the world of episode of care that we're currently living in? And my feeling is it's going to be an indirect model from the standpoint of being the stickiness to the products that are used. That remains to be seen, but it's something that these companies are going to grapple with because they're making significant sunk costs into developing AI. So I would submit to you the future is loading from the standpoint of how we improve on the durable outcomes for our patients. And we hope that this will be the case with digital technology, but we don't know for sure. And this talk is going to change significantly in the coming few years. Thank you.
That was a great end to this session. We have a time now for discussion. If anyone would like to put anything in the discussion group, fine. If any of the presenters have questions for other presenters, now's the time to speak up. I actually have a bit of a question. There's two 800-pound gorillas in the room. One of those is the lack of revenue, the lack of discussion of revenue. We're talking so much about cost, but the insurance companies we're not talking about as much. And so we're having a big revenue drain. And the second thing is, why are these implants so expensive? I mean, I kind of direct that a little bit to Andrew on the idea of, these shoulder implants. I mean, as a chair, I buy them for the hospital, and I could put in a knee with 3 cones, and it's the same price as a shoulder. So trying to figure out, that the implant companies are making 20-30% a year. The insurance companies are making god-awful amount of money, and we're trying to squeeze, and we're having 63% of our costs are the implants. So, what about the role of revenue and why are these implants so expensive?
Yeah, I'll take that. I don't know why they're so expensive. I know manufacturing is a little bit more, let's say, for a reverse, because there are more components. Are they artificially high because there's less volume done? That's sort of what I was implying. Maybe. I don't really know the answer to that. I think there's something to be said about that, and that we're willing to pay that at this point. And I agree with you about revenue. And I sort of that's sort of what I brought up a little bit about how I do think this is a race to the bottom. And if you're in an academic setting, honestly, I don't think it's a black box. You don't know how much you're making, where it's going, while in private practice, you know it to the details. If you're in a surgery center, you know the details. But at the end of the day, you are subject to what Medicare pays you. And in this case, for shoulder arthroplasty, or what commercial insurance pays you. And right now, it's good for shoulder arthroplasty starting January 1st. But if you look at hip and knee, it's going to go down. And, when I left Mass General as a resident, they used to say, I'll do 3 arthroplasties by 3. That's a great day. I just talked to a colleague who is a resident with me who does 8 a day. We're just gerbils on this, this wheel. And, maybe it's good for society that we're doing more at cheaper costs, but it's certainly not good for surgeons. And I'm not sure what the solution is. But that's my observation in a private situation, and trying to create revenue streams like surgery centers and implants and things like that.
Ira, I just want to make sure to
Sure.
take advantage of the fact that Susanna is still on here, as I want her to make a comment about this, because it seems to me this is just simple economics. With hip and knee, you have large volume, lots of alternatives available. And so, of course, you're going to have an effect on pricing. When the reverse prosthesis came out, and the Grimmel prosthesis was the only one released, it was first mover advantage, and the hospital lost money on it, but had an ethical responsibility to deliver care to the patient. But as new entrants came into the market, the price was cut significantly. And that's really where shoulder is going. Now, shoulder is growing more than twice as fast as hip or knee. So it's hard to imagine that effect isn't going to come onto shoulder, and follow what's happened with hip and knee. We're just a significantly smaller book of business than hip or knee. Can you comment on that, Susanna, and maybe keep us honest on this question?
Sure. Well, I'll just share my thoughts. First of all, there's a lot of willingness to pay, right? So they can charge a lot because people buy them. And maybe because there's not enough competition, or the competition is not effective at keeping prices down. So nobody is undercutting the others in terms of setting a lower price point that could still get them sufficient margins. I don't know anything about the implant industry, I should say. But if I think about pharmaceuticals, their justification is generally based on, we have to fund R&D. And I don't know how much R&D spend is present in the implant industry. I really don't know that. So, but that's something to assess, right? So are we funding the next generation of implants that are going to be 10x better? I don't know. With respect to revenue, how do we change that? Well, we need payers to pay for outcomes and not for procedures. How do we do that? My thought, again, this is just my personal opinion, so don't take it as a scholarly validated, is that we need to work with the employers. Whoever purchases the plans for their employees, whoever is ultimately paying for healthcare, is the entity that has the negotiating power over the insurers. And so, for example, Harvard University is self-insured, but we have contracts with Blue Cross Blue Shield, and I don't remember who the other option is. So if Harvard University were to push for, no, I really want you to deliver better healthcare, I'm going to hold you accountable, and I want you to drive and buy on my behalf better outcomes. That's how we start changing the revenue proposition. It's going to take a long time, but I am having a lot of conversations with employers, trying to wake them up on this aspect that your health benefits should no longer be considered benefits, but should be considered part of your value proposition with your employees. So that's my overarching thought. I don't know if it's helpful.
There's a question from Hemath Aladu. Hemant, you have your hand
Hi,
up.
hi, Doc. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I thank Dr. JP for it for the invitation. And the most important thing in the cost management here, what we are forgetting is the company support team which comes into the OR. In all our operation theater, we have always a company person who is trying to help us out. That increases the cost quite a bit. Most of the times we need a company person to give the implant proper size or assist us, or a physician assistant who comes into the theater. If this can be addressed by the associations, the implant cost will automatically come down for the companies also to manage a big physician assistant clinical group who can assist us in the operation theater.
Andy, Andy, could you comment on that? You did the analysis of the episode of care. Where does that find itself in terms of, is that in your pie graph that you showed?
It isn't. It's an interesting question. I don't know how much that adds, but it's a good question. I'm not quite sure how to even look at that. We'd have to ask the companies. I'm
That's
sure
where
that
the
adds so
weakness
much.
of the surgeon. That's the weakness of the surgeon, where we pay very quite a bit higher price for the company.
Yeah, I don't know. Good question though.
Yeah. Any other questions on this right now? I mean, I've
Yeah,
been.
I got a good question.
Yeah.
Hey, Andy and JP, great talks. It's Tiger from BU, and I just got a question for you guys. What is the cost of reverse at the Baptist and versus the MGH? Who determines that cost that comes in? And I know for us, at BMC, I'm the only person doing reverse, and it's about $11,000 to come in for the reverse. I know the Baptist is cheaper. I try to do it at the Natick ASC with Shields, and they're, the guy there, Prashant, is telling me you got to come in under 6,000 for reverse to get in there. So who determines that cost? How do you make that determination, and what it is to come into your institution, and what it is at Baptist and the MGH? Thank you.
Andy, you in the co-management model there, you already touched on it. Why don't you reinforce that? Because I know your answer, I think.
I mean, the simple answer is it's volume. You do more volume, you're going to have lower costs. And if you can assure that you can do so much, you'll negotiate with implant companies. There are a lot of other things that make this confusing because these are published numbers. So they won't say, hey, this is what you get. They'll give you a rebate because they want to keep it artificially high. The low volume users, which is, the majority of people who do less than 20 shoulder replacements a year, they can pay the extreme amount, and then they'll give the rebate to the people who are high volume. And then surgery centers now that are huge everywhere across the country, they're really trying to be one vendor places. So all the arthroscopy towers, Stryker, implants or Stryker, they'll give you a huge discount if you just do one vendor. And that's how things are changing. So yes, it's about volume. Is the short answer.
I'll answer from my experience. We've had in the past this VAT committee. Sometimes you find yourself on it and sometimes not. And usually if you're the one using the expensive product, you get berated by the supply chain people, and you get to see the numbers for the others. But, it's not really, we're not aligned, right? So if I save the hospital any amount of money, I don't get a thank you. If I lose the hospital any amount of money, I don't really get to see the numbers like you showed there. So we're doing the exact opposite of what your group is doing and what Hans was talking about. And so at the end of the day, it feels to me like the hospital is making decisions on their own. I honestly don't know how they come to arrive at their decisions. They do the negotiation. I have no idea about how they manage the RFP, etc. Because that's not shared with us. We're not part of the process where I work, at least to my knowledge, we're not.
And if I could piggyback on that, and I'm making a value judgment here, but this is one of my issues with academic medical centers, and I sort of alluded to it. It is a black box. You don't understand where all these numbers are coming from, and I think transparency is key. And this is one example of that.
I think this is a great discussion. JP, you want to sum up some things?
Yeah, I mean, the purpose of my thinking of the Codman group and the collaboration that we have here, which is great, is that we talk about things that we don't usually deal with day in and day out, but they're central to the survival of, our engagement and involvement in patient care. And they're not the things that we learn through our training. And so bringing people together like we have here really is enlightening for people that are in a position potentially to change the way we do business, to change the way we function, to change our connection to our institutions and collaboration with our institutions. Otherwise, I mean, we have an unsustainable model with the way things are going with a GDP now was about 18%. The only way, my way of thinking, to change this is to change it from within with some kind of a collaboration and alignment that so far has not existed, period. And frankly, taking care of a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle, like I've done, the vast majority of these folks have no idea what they're voting on. Zero. Probably the smartest politician I ever took care of, and it's not HIPAA anymore because he's passed away, was Orrin Hatch, who was very, very knowledgeable and aware of this, and we had a very good discussion about it. But most of the other politicians I've talked with, they don't have the foggiest notion about all of these things, and they largely do groupthink when they vote on things that affect all of us. So we have to play a more active role. We have to produce data. There's an expression that Lenny Johnson, who is a famous entrepreneur, used. He said, there's a war out there, and data is ammunition, and physicians don't have any. And so, I think Bob signed off, but one of the most important things that Bob said, if you can't manage it, you can't measure it. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And if you don't manage it, you can't improve it. And we are woeful at measuring things, let alone using them as a basis for changing the way we do business. And that's what this is all about, getting everybody enthusiastic about looking at the data and using it as a lever to change things rather than your opinion as your lever. And that's the only way we're going to change and improve healthcare in this country, in my opinion. So I think we're at time. We're 7 minutes over time. I really appreciate everybody coming. For those who missed this, share with your friends that this will be posted on the Codman website. There may be some publications coming from this in Joey, depending on what Ira thinks about. And Avant-Garde has been a very, very important partner in all of this. And again, I said measure. Avant-Garde is the key to doing that because it automates the process and has a lot of smart people to help you answer the questions that you need to ask in the first place. So thanks, everybody. Have a good evening. And thank you so much for participating in this 9th meeting of our group.